Good evening. My name is Ashley Scoville, a Kevin B. Harrington Student Ambassador here at the New Hampshire Institute of Politics and Political Library. On behalf of the faculty, staff, and students here at the Institute, I'd like to welcome you to this evening's event. The Institute's mission is to engage and empower citizens of all ages to actively participate in our democracy. However, the Institute does not endorse political issues or candidates. Before we start tonight's program, I would like to remind you to please turn off any cell phones or other devices that may make noise, and that there will be a question and answer session after the presentation. But if you have a question, please wait until an ambassador with a microphone gets to you before you start speaking. Tonight's program will feature Mr. Rick Perlstein. Mr. Perlstein has established himself as a well-recognized author through his books such as Nixonland, The Rise of a President, and The Fracturing of America, which was on the New York Times bestseller list as one of the best nonfiction books of 2008. And Before the Storm, Barry Goldwater and the Unmaking of the American Consensus, which appeared on the Best Book of the Year list for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Chicago Tribune. He also has several essays and book reviews that have been published in The New Yorker, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and The Nation, to name a few. Lastly, he has also received a National Endowment for the Humanities Grant for Independent Scholars. Mr. Perlstein is here tonight to present his work, The Invisible Bridge, The Fall of Nixon, and the Rise of Reagan. After the Watergate scandal of 1973, Americans felt disheartened with the loss of Nixon, the end of the Vietnam War, an economy in shambles, and congressional investigations proving the CIA's involvement in foreign assassinations. As a result of these problems, the American public lost hope in the idea that America was provincial. It was predicted that the next president would have to accept this now widespread American view that America was a nation among nations. However, presidential hopeful Ronald Reagan never accepted such an idea. Although he lost the Republican nomination to President Ford for the 1976 election, he managed to significantly change conservative political culture. The Invisible Bridge asked the question, what does it mean to believe in America? To wave a flag or to reject the glibness of the flag wavers? Ladies and gentlemen, please help me to welcome Mr. Rick Perlstein.
Hi, thanks, friends. Last time I was here in Manchester was covering the 2004 primaries for the Village Voice, and I decided I was going to really show my reporter that I was a tough shoe leather guy. So I walked out onto a ice fishing lake to interview folks about who they were supporting, and of course they couldn't care less. None of them were interested. They were interested in ice fishing, and now I come back in October, and it feels like it's like 80 degrees. I feel like I'm in Florida or something. Anyway, I'm going to make a presentation from the preface of my book, which is also, it's an inducement to ask questions of the sort my introduction raised. So, without further ado, this is a book about how Ronald Reagan came within a hair's breadth of becoming the 1976 Republican nominee for president. But it is also about much more. In the years between 1973 and 1976, America suffered more wounds to its ideal of itself than at just about any other time in its history. First, in January of 1973, when Richard Nixon declared America's role in the Vietnam War over, some 58,000 Americans dead. $699 billion expended in American treasure. Nixon called this peace with honor. But that just obscured the fact that America had lost its first war. Then, almost immediately, televised hearings on the complex of presidential abuses known as Watergate revealed the men entrusted with the White House as little better, or possibly worse, than common criminals. In what a senator called a national funeral that goes on day after day after day. Then in October came the Arab oil embargo, and suddenly Americans learned overnight that the commodity that underpinned their lifestyle was vulnerable to something called shocks, and that the world's mightiest economy could be held hostage by some mysterious cabal of third world sheikhs. This list omits a dozen smaller traumas in between. One of my favorites, lost to everyday historical memory, was the near doubling of meat prices in the spring of 1973, when the president's consumer advisor went on TV and informed viewers that liver, kidney, brains, and heart can be made into gourmet meals with seasoning, imagination, and more cooking time. In the next years, the traumas continued, compounding. The end of a presidency, accompanied by fears that Richard Nixon might seek to hold office by force of arms. Inflation such as America had never known in peacetime. A recession that saw hundreds of thousands of blue-collar workers idle during Christmas time. Crime in a volume and ghastliness greater, according to one observer, than at any time since the 15th century. Senate and House hearings on the Central Intelligence Agency that accused American presidents since Dwight Eisenhower of commanding squads of lawless assassins. With these traumas emerged a new sort of American politics, a stark discourse of reckoning. What kind of nation, we asked, were we to suffer such humiliations, so suddenly, so unceasingly, so unexpectedly? According to one expert, for the first time, Americans have had at least a partial loss in the fundamental belief in ourselves. We've always believed we were the new men, the new people, the new society, the last best hope on earth, in Lincoln's terms. For the first time, we've really begun to doubt it. And that was only February of 1973. By 1976, a presidential year, such observations would become so routine that when the nation geared up for a massive celebration of its bicentennial, it was common for editorialists and columnists to question whether America deserved to hold a birthday party at all, and whether the party could come off without massive bloodshed, given that, according to the FBI, there had been 89 bombings attributed to terrorism in 1975. The liberals of the New Republic reflected upon the occasion of the most harrowing 1975 trauma, the military collapse of our ally South Vietnam, the nation on whose behalf we had expended those thousands of lives and billions of dollars, that, quote, if the bicentennial helps us focus on the contrast between our idealism and our crimes, so much the better. Now, the most ambitious politicians endeavor to speak to this new, chastened national mood. An entire class of them, the Watergate babies, were swept into Congress in 1975, pledging thoroughgoing reform of America's broken institutions. And nearly alone among ambitious politicians, Ronald Reagan took a different road. Returning to the nation's attention toward the end of his second term as California's governor, as pundits began speculating about which Republican might succeed Richard Nixon and then which ones might succeed his replacement, Gerald Ford, Reagan, whenever he was asked about Watergate, insisted it said nothing important at all. Asked about Vietnam, he'd say the only dishonor was that Americans had not expended enough violence. That, quote, the greatest immorality is to ask young men to fight or die for my country. If it's not a cause, we are willing to win. One of the quotes he liked to repeat in those years came from Pope Pius XII, writing in Collier's magazine in 1945, back when the United States was on top of the world. The Pope said, the American people have a genius for great and unselfish deeds. Into the hands of America, God has placed the destiny of an afflicted mankind. Now, when Reagan began getting attention for talking this way in America's season of melancholy, Washington's touts cited him only to dismiss him. No one who called the Watergate burglars not criminals at heart, as Reagan added in the spring of 1973, could be taken seriously as a political comer. But a central theme of my previous two books, chronicling conservatism's rise in American politics, has been the myopia of pundits, who so frequently fail to notice the very cultural ground shifting beneath their feet. In fact, at every turn in America's reckoning with its apparent decline, there were always dissenting voices from the right. They said things like, Richard Nixon just couldn't be a bad guy, and that America just couldn't be surrendering its role as God's chosen nation, that it wasn't possible. At first, such voices sounded mainly in the interstices of America's political discourse, in letters to the editor, among right-wing institution builders whose industriousness exploiting the cultural confusions of the 1970s was being largely ignored by the guardians of polite opinion, in conservative churches whose pews grew more crowded even as experts insisted religious belief was in radical decline. Very bad prediction. But these voices were moving from the margins to the center. This was related to what Ronald Reagan was accomplishing politically, but things shifted independently of him too. Here's a headline from July 4th, 1976. Nation's hunger to feel good erupts in fever of patriotism. The keynote of articles like this, which were common, was surprise. Surprise that it wasn't that hard to unapologetically celebrate America after all. As Elizabeth Drew, Washington's most sure-footed chronicler of the passing political scene, and certainly no conservative herself, wrote in her article in the New Yorker that day, the feelings of the day sort of crept up on many of us, took us by surprise. There was a spirit to it that could not have been anticipated. For those of us who had been in despair about the bicentennial 4th of July, who feared the worst, the surprise was a very pleasing one. Now, this book is about how that shift in American sentiment began. And it's also a sort of biography of Ronald Reagan rescuer. He had been a sullen little kid from a chaotic, alcoholic home, whose mother's passion for saving fallen souls could never save her own husband. It also seemed to have kept her out of the house almost constantly. But by the time of Ronald Reagan's adolescence, the boy who told his friends to call him Dutch had cultivated an extraordinary gift in the act of rescuing himself. The ability to radiate blithe optimism in the face of what others called chaos. To reimagine the morass in front of him as a tableau of simple moral clarity. He did the same thing, decades later, as a politician, skillfully reframing situations that those of a more critical temper saw as an irresolvable muddle, like, say, the Vietnam War, as crystalline, black and white melodrama. This was key to what made others feel so good in his presence, what made them so eager and willing to follow him, what made him a leader. But it was why, simultaneously, he was such a controversial leader. Others, witnessing precisely this quality, saw him as a phony and a hustler. In this book, Ronald Reagan is not a uniter, he is, in essence, a divider. And understanding the precise ways that opinion about him divided Americans, as in my earlier book that focused on the national divisions revolving around Richard Nixon, better helps us understand our political order of battle today. How Americans divide themselves. The pattern emerged extraordinarily early. In 1966, when Reagan, the TV host and former actor in B movies, shocked the political universe by winning the Republican nomination for California governor, a young aspiring journalist began researching a profile of him that never got published, because no one really cared that much about Ronald Reagan. Industriously, the young journalist tracked down acquaintances who had attended tiny Eureka College in central Illinois with Reagan, or taught him there between 1928 and 1932. The divergent recollections of Reagan map precisely onto how they would sound if you corralled a random sample of politically attuned citizens today. Half remembered him as a hero and a figure of destiny. Here are some quotes. Always articulate, always had an idea, always moving, always had a program, always with action and words. My sister is a classmate of his, and she and others thought he had a great future. Another. He was a respected leader of campus life. He was a first-class gentleman, a conscientious, dedicated fellow. He was always committed to principles and big ideals. Now, that was the first half. The second half judged him as the opposite. Shallow at best, a manipulative fraud at worst. Here are some of those. Dutch was the cautious big man on a small campus. He'd run a mile to avoid controversy. If this is governor of California material, I don't know what I am. Very immature, strictly rah-rah. He was a personable guy, but I never felt he was really a human being or that he did anything spontaneously. Another called him a whale of a good cheerleader. Reagan made his biggest impression on me in leading yells. The last one. Ronald Reagan was a man who was spending a great deal of time impressing the populace with little evidence of depth. I don't think he is intelligent enough to be cynical. So there it is. Before Ronald Reagan has served a single day in any office, a polarity of opinion had been set, and it has endured forevermore. On the one side, those who saw him as a rescuer, hero, redeemer. Read this handwritten get-well note he received in the Oval Office after the 1981 assassination attempt against him. It referred to his first job as a youthful lifeguard. I met you in the 1920s in Lowell Park, Illinois. Do you remember the good times we had in the 20s? You were 17 years old then, and everyone called you Dutch. Please get well soon. We need you to save this country, just like you saved all those lives in Lowell Park. The letter appears in a religious biography of Reagan that argues that his coming into the world, culminating with his single-handed defeat of the Soviet Empire, was literally providential, the working out of God's plan. On the other side, there are those who found Reagan the phony, the fraud, the toady. The first time such an opinion of Reagan shows up in the historical record is in his high school yearbook. He's depicted fishing a suicide out of the water as a lifeguard, who begs, "Don't rescue me, I want to die." Reagan responds, "Well, you'll have to postpone that. I want a medal." It's okay, you can laugh. Like the Reagan worship, the Reagan hate lives on. I think of a friend of mine who grew up in California in the 1960s and 70s. I'd wanted to share this manuscript with her, thinking it would benefit from her brilliance. She told me I'd best not send it. She couldn't think straight about Ronald Reagan because of her rage. Her beef, and that of millions of others, was simple. That all that turbulence in the 1960s and the 1970s had given the nation a chance to finally reflect critically upon its power, to shed its arrogance, to become a more humble and better citizen of the world, to grow up. But that Ronald Reagan's rise nipped that imperative in the bud. Immanuel Kant defined the Enlightenment, the sweeping 18th century intellectual and political movement that saw all settled conceptions of society thrown up in the air, which introduced radical new concepts of liberty and dignity, dethroned God, and made human reason the new measure of all things, a little like the 1960s and 70s. He called Enlightenment man's emergence from his self-incurred immaturity. For these citizens, what Reagan achieved foreclosed that imperative, that Americans might learn to question leaders ruthlessly, throw aside the silly notion that American power was always innocent, and think like grown-ups. They had been proposing a new definition of patriotism, one built upon questioning authority and unsettling ossified norms. Then along came Ronald Reagan, encouraging citizens to think like children, they say, waiting for a man on horseback to rescue them, and that this is a tragedy. The division was there even among his own offspring. Maureen, for instance, his eldest, his daughter, who became a Republican activist. She wrote at the time her father, as governor, missed one more in a train of important milestones in his life. She cast it in the most optimistic possible way. I think Dad always regretted times like these, at least a little bit, the way the tug and pull of his public life kept him from enjoying firsthand the successes of his children. Oh, he enjoyed them with us in spirit, and he was always there for us emotionally. She wrote in a similar way of both her and her brother Michael missing their father's wedding to his second wife because they were both stashed away by their self-absorbed parents at boarding schools. She said it was for the best. My folks wanted only the smallest ceremonies. She was her father's daughter. In this book, you will read how Ronald Reagan framed even the most traumatic events in his life, even his father's funeral, as always working out gloriously in the end, evidence that the universe was just. And you'll also read about Ronald Reagan showing up at his son Michael's funeral as the celebrity and not recognizing his own son. At the other pole, there was his daughter, Patty, the rock and rolling liberal. She wrote, "I had been taught to keep secrets, to keep our image intact for the world. Under our family's definition of loyalty, the public should never see that under a carefully preserved surface was a group of people who knew how to inflict wounds and then convincingly say those wounds never existed." She wrote of how her mother, Nancy, beat her, was addicted to pills, and used their house's state-of-the-art intercom system installed by General Electric, their corporate benefactor, as a tool for Orwellian surveillance. Maureen described that same intercom system as a providential gift, writing at the time it broadcast the sound of little Ron, the youngest, crashing to the floor in the nursery, which allowed them to save his life. You might call Maureen's version denial. And liberals are always accusing conservatives of being in denial. Call Patty a cynic, always seeing everything in a negative light. And God knows conservatives are always accusing liberals of doing that. Optimism, pessimism. America the innocent, America the compromised. These incommensurate polarities have come to be a part of the very structure of the left versus right political divide in American life. As much as the debate over the role of government, led by Barry Goldwater, that I described in my first book, Before the Storm, and the culture war between mutually recriminating cultural sophisticates on the one hand and the plain, earnest silent majority on the other, that I wrote about in my second book, Nixon Land. Note well, though, that Reagan's side in this battle of political affect, at least, if not policy, carried out above the everyday minutiae of policy debates and electoral tallies, has prevailed. Okay? Listen to Liz Cheney in 2009, speaking for Republican multitudes. "I believe unequivocally and unapologetically America is the best nation that ever existed in history." And here is Mitt Romney accepting the Republican nomination in 2012, speaking of the day he watched Neil Armstrong land on the moon. "Like all Americans, we went to bed that night knowing we lived in the greatest country in the world." He'd been saying the same sort of thing on the campaign trail all year in nearly every speech. A Google search for Mitt Romney and greatest nation in the history of the earth just yielded me 114,000 hits. Such utterances, of course, are meant to be an ideological reproach to Democrats, supposedly always apologizing for America. As if. Here was San Antonio Mayor Julian Castro's keynote address to the Democratic National Convention in 2012. "Ours is a nation like no other. No matter who you are or where you come from, the path is always forward." The First Lady, Michelle Obama, spoke of her campaign journeys to meet Americans around the country. "Every day they make me proud. Every day they remind me how blessed we are to live in the greatest nation on earth." Then her husband, accepting the Democratic nomination. "We keep our eyes fixed on that distant horizon, knowing that Providence is with us, and we are surely blessed to be citizens of the greatest nation on earth." A very Reaganite formulation. And here is Samantha Power. The president's choice to become ambassador to the United Nations, a Harvard professor, a great scholar of genocides and human rights. At her confirmation hearings, early in 2013, questioned about a magazine article she had published over a decade earlier, in which she wrote that American foreign policy needed, quote, "a historical reckoning with crimes committed, sponsored, or permitted by the United States." Senator Marco Rubio, Republican of Florida, he's probably been around these parts a time or two, demanded to know what crimes she was referring to. She would only respond, "America is the greatest country in the world, and we have nothing to apologize for." This is a book about how such rhetoric came into being and how such hubris comes to define us now. In certain ways, we live in some of the darkest times in our history. Global warming threatens to engulf us. Political polarization threatens to paralyze us. The economy nearly collapsed because of the failure of the banking regulatory regime. Competition from China threatens to overwhelm us. Social mobility is at its lowest point in generations, to name only a few versions of the national apocalypse that yet may come. But at the same time, somehow, something almost like an official cult of optimism, the greatest nation in the history of the earth, saturates the land. How did it happen? That is one of the questions the invisible bridge poses. Here is another, to borrow from my gracious introduction. What does it mean to truly be an American? To wave a flag, or to struggle toward a more searching alternative to the flag wavers? To criticize, to interrogate, to analyze, to dissent? During the years covered in these pages, America debated that question with an intensity unmatched before or since, even if they didn't always know this was what they were doing. I hope this volume might become a spur to renewing that debate in these years, a time that cries for reckoning once more in a nation that has ever so adored its own innocence and so dearly wishes to see itself as an exception to history. Thank you. How long do we have for questions? Great.
Thanks for coming.
Are you Neil?
I am Neil. I was late. I was in traffic.
Dr.
So that's
Levesque.
why I didn't get to say hello. I love this book. I'll tell you, Nixon Land, too, was, I think, one of the best perspectives on a period of time that I have ever read. And so I compliment you. We have a lot of authors that come here, but we also have a lot of candidates, as you mentioned. And they go up to that podium, and we kind of have a joke that if they're on the right side, that we can almost count down the seconds until they mention RR or Ronald Reagan. So since Nixon Land was so great, and I'm fascinated between the interaction between Nixon and Reagan, if he knew about that myth that goes on now, what would he say about it today? If he were frank and here, what would he say about it? So thank you.
I think inside, his heart would sing. I think he always wished to see himself as a heroic figure. That's how he cast himself. I think externally, he would probably mumble something very humble and gracious, because he learned from the storybook heroes that he read as a boy that that's how a hero is supposed to behave. Think of Superman, and Superman in 1978. It's like the hero never toots his own horn, right? The hero is always modest. The hero doesn't pick a fight; he waits for a fight. Now, to be fair, Republicans will always mention Ronald Reagan and put him up on a pedestal. If this was the 1980s or even into the 1990s, how many seconds would it be before one of those Democrats mentioned John F. Kennedy, right? It's one of the things we do. We create heroes. We create martyrs. It's part of the political process. It's part of the storytelling process of politics. With the Republicans, it's been especially salient, partly because there are just so few other kind of candidates, right? Eisenhower was a great hero, but as far as an ideology, if you're a conservative, Barry Goldwater, the first conservative hero in 1964, said his budget was the siren song of socialism, and he embraced the New Deal and said that any candidate who criticized Social Security would destroy the Republican Party. Their next Republican president was Richard Nixon, and of course we all know what happened to him. And then Gerald Ford, who would always bump his head against helicopters and fall downstairs, even though, as I point out in the book, he was the best athlete of any president we ever had, like by far. Like he'd always be like skiing down the expert slopes at Vail, and the Secret Service agents would always, be trailing, half a mile behind. But the one time he did fall, it would always be on TV, right? And I make an argument about what that meant and why that happened. That kind of the president, again, thinking of symbols, thinking of heroes, thinking of the fact that presidents also, they have a real body, but they have a symbolic body too. It's a famous political theory text, "The King Has Two Bodies." The body politic was really shambling and weak and pathetic, and couldn't get its act together, right? America was so screwed up, so he became a symbol of that, right? America couldn't do anything right. The president couldn't do anything right. There's George H.W. Bush, a one-termer who, defied his pledge, read my lips, no new taxes. And then there's George W. Bush, who, brought us Iraq and failed in Katrina, and conservatives now claim to have rejected him and said he wasn't really one of them. So you're kind of left with Reagan. But Reagan was always very good at, again, making people feel good about him because of his ability to kind of project this stalwart, clarion optimism, even when everything looked incredibly grim. So I think we're going to see it for a while now, even though, and this might be another question people have, some of his actual policies and activities in office, both as governor and president, make his identity as a conservative hero more complicated than the myth would allow. Yes.
More of a comment that has to do with what you were just talking about with Reagan and the body part. I remember watching him in Reykjavik coming out of one of the very cold, on a very cold day, coming out with Gorbachev, who was indeed younger. But Reagan knew how to position himself, and he came out with no overcoat,
Right.
and his hair was perfect. And it was just the typical Reagan move where
Right.
Gorbachev looked like an old man. He was huddled
Yeah.
in this old wool coat, and Reagan was helping him down the stairs. And I thought, oh, that's just so typical Reagan.
Right.
I didn't know if that was really truly who he was, or was he always aware that he was positioning himself that way?
Let me read you a little bit from the book. And on the way to that, I'll point out a couple things. First of all, conservatives were very critical of Reagan at the time for selling out and negotiating with the evil Soviet Union. Another point about Reagan is liberals like to talk about how stupid he is, but he would undertake very complex negotiations with Gorbachev without any aides being president, the famous walk in the woods. And he's the only president who is responsible for eliminating an entire class of nuclear weapons, medium-range nuclear weapons. So let's see here. You're right. Okay. There's a picture. I talk about how he was a really lonely and sad boy. I talk about a terrible childhood he had, and how kind of before the age of 10, all the kind of testimony we have of him is that he was always kind of off by himself, and he was also kind of always had a distant look in his eyes in the very few photographs that we have of him before the age of 10. I said there's a picture of Ronald Reagan from the summer when he was 10, a group shot of the caddies for a ladies' golf tournament in Dixon. That's the town he lived. His brother, Moon Reagan, is front and center, poised jauntily with a golf bag beside him, looking confidently into the camera. Dutch is awkwardly off to the side, as if eager to escape from the frame. Most of the boys are hatless, though some wear those sporty 1920s newsboy caps. Reagan alone is covered by a dweebish beanie. He looks distant, hardly present. He looks like the kind of boy he actually was, lonely and a little bit scared, the figure described by one writer on Chaotic Families as the boy who disappears. She writes of quiet and withdrawn children like these. Because they try so hard to stay invisible, they are often overlooked by people who might be able to help them. The photograph fitted others' recollections of him, that he looked subdued, shy and retiring, that he would sit for hours looking at those glass and case collections. He would collect birds' eggs and things like that. That he was very quiet and could go for all hours playing with himself with lead soldiers. This does not sound like Ronald Reagan. This sounds like some other person. There was another group photo, including Ronald Reagan, taken perhaps a year later. Again, he is off to one side, but this time it is because the other boys serve as his retinue. Neil and Dutch have joined the new boys' marching band, organized by the Dixon YMCA. All alone in his room, he has been practicing baton twirling, just like he had seen in the Armistice Day parade in Monmouth, with a broomstick or an old brass bedpost. He's practicing. He's looking in the mirror. He's thinking about how he looks. Here he has the photographs. And so the formerly timid boy was chosen as drum major. Here he is the photograph star, and he knows it. He proudly displays his gold-tipped staff and his nifty striped tie. He's the only boy wearing one. His feet are precisely splayed, hip proudly forward. Alone among the boys, he seems to understand that if you cock your elbow in just the right way, the cape that is part of their uniform juts out with a jaunty flare instead of lying flat. And then there's that face. It is alive. It is the face of Ronald Reagan. He would never appear lost, forlorn, or empty-eyed in a photograph again. Try to find one. And I talk more about that, but I talk about how something about how he always seems aware of the camera's gaze, and he seems, in fact, as aware of the lines his body presents before the viewer as a dancer, right? And I go on and give my theory about why he was able to transform him that way and why that affected his biography. And one of the theories about the way I kind of write about politics is that kind of one of my theories of leadership is that kind of the leader kind of projecting his innermost kind of longings and passions that are personal to him becomes adapted as a great leader by the rest of the country, or at least by half the country, which usually happens in this very divided country of ours, because those passions and longings and even anxieties reflect the longings of the broader public. So in the case of Reagan, we're talking about a country in the 70s that just felt like such a moral muddle. And that kind of clarity, that kind of confidence really spoke to the nation at that particular juncture in our history. In the same way, Barack Obama, think about how divided the nation feels in 2007 and 2008, how kind of morose we are, not being able to heal the wounds of our divisions. And this guy comes forward. He's from Africa. He's from Kansas. He has this Kansan grandmother. He has this African father. He's lived in Indonesia. He's been to Harvard. He's lived in Chicago. And he speaks about there is no red America and there is no blue America. He's written a whole memoir about how he kind of unites all opposites and struggles for an identity. He speaks to what the nation was looking for in 2008. And then there's other stuff. There's legislation and there's, power, and all that stuff is interesting, and that's in the book too. But this idea of kind of presidents as myth makers, as storytellers, is very important to the kind of work that I do. Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. I thought it was awesome. One question that I had was, I'm a history major, so for much of my education, this idea of America being the greatest nation on earth isn't something that's relatively new, even in times of Reagan. And I was thinking automatically back to the Calvinists and the shining city upon a hill. And I was wondering if there was anything in your research that you found that either Reagan picked up on that shining city upon a hill from the Calvinists or other parts of history, or if there was anything maybe in his past otherwise that kind of prompted him to have that idea.
Right. Well, let me speak on a couple things. So why did he was famous. He used that phrase, America shall be as a shining city on a hill. Right, that's very famous. He used that in a lot of his speeches. He started using it in 1976 when he ran for president first. Again, as the country was kind of feeling very negative about itself. Let me make a couple points about that. First of all, it comes from a very, very famous Puritan sermon, but the sermon did not mention shining city on a hill. Reagan just made that part up. It was just city on a hill, but he made it sound better by saying shiny city on a hill. But here's the important point. That sermon was not about America being the greatest place in the world. It wasn't about the Puritans as the greatest, flawless, sparkling people that were going to, inspire the whole world. I'm forgetting the name of the great Puritan who gave the speech. I'm so embarrassed. Do you remember?
I think it was John Winthrop.
It was John, not Winthrop. But anyway, the point of that speech was exactly the opposite of what Reagan interprets it. he said America was a shining city on the hill. The eyes of the world are upon it. Because he meant we have to hold ourselves to a much sterner standard of morality, that we should be more self-critical, more willing to apologize for America, as the conservatives put it. And Reagan, as he often did with the speeches of Franklin Roosevelt, took the rhetoric that resonated with him and often kind of inverted its original intention. The other point about Reagan in history, I've been writing actually. Are you guys familiar with a debate that's going on right now about the, I know you guys all must have been in AP history, right? The AP history program. Anyone speaking Socratically want to explain what that's about? You know?
How they're reshaping the exam?
Right. The exam is the same basically, but the materials and how to prepare for the exam, which are created by the College Board and are completely voluntary, they've come out with new 60-page guidelines. And conservatives have been enormously critical about it. The RNC came out with a resolution against it. Texas has banned it. There's the second biggest school district in Colorado has undergone a curricular review for AP history, and the students walked out in protest. Their teachers walked out in protest. So we had this huge controversy. And what's most fascinating about it to me is, as you might expect from the right, they criticize it for not paying enough attention to our founding fathers and not talking enough about America being great and America as a light unto the nation. But what's more interesting to me is they depict it as sad, pessimistic, that American history should be uplifting, happy, it should make you feel good. And again, this completely plays into why I wrote this book and what it's about. And I'm critical of that outlook because to me, you can't solve your problems unless you acknowledge your problems, right? And I write about, in this book, and all my books actually, that's kind of like, we know a lot about conservatism as an ideology. No one's ever kind of teased out why conservatives are so allergic to kind of negativity in their thinking, right? I mean, it's complicated. There's lots of things that they criticize. There's lots of things that all of us criticize. But this whole idea that America has to be kind of set apart as this place where good things happen, right? When we all know it's more complicated than that. And I would say that Ronald Reagan, the history he learned as a schoolboy was probably that kind of positive affirmative history. They learned about the Panama Canal, right? This great heroic accomplishment of American engineering, which in actuality, as one of the senators who became a senator from California in the 60s, S.I. Hayakawa said, well, we stole it fair and square. Right? And it became a big issue on the campaign trail in 1976 because this treaty to create the Panama Canal, to make a long story short, was not exactly up to the moral standards of the modern world, and a series of presidents, starting with bipartisan administrations, starting with the LBJ, had undergone negotiations to basically eventually return it to the Panamanians to run. And after we lost Vietnam, and after there was all this negativity, and after there was all this self-doubt about America, Ronald Reagan got an enormous mileage and won a ton of primaries in 1976, saying that this was a giveaway, that this was like giving away Texas or Missouri, and that his line was, we bought it, we paid for it, we built it, it's ours. That kind of stalwart, kind of a certain kind of flag-waving patriotism, right? And what's going on in the 1970s is people are beginning to question that. People are saying, after this Vietnam War disaster, well, what if we didn't act like the world's policemen? What if we didn't feel like we had to kind of ride in like the cavalry and sort of save every situation around the world? What if we realized that our consuming was out of control and that we bear some responsibility for the oil crisis? What if we began to think about that? There's all kinds of debates going on. And after Watergate, what if we didn't trust our leaders as much? Maybe we should, be a little more skeptical and wary. And maybe there's something about America itself that's a problem. And it's a very interesting kind of thing that's going on. Again, this kind of America kind of shedding its innocence, right? But Reagan is very discouraging of that, and he kind of rides a wave of people who think this is just basically a terrible way for a great nation to go about pursuing its destiny.
We have time for one more question.
Yeah, yeah, over there. And I'll be able to answer questions when I sign books.
So you sort of talked about it earlier when you said that Reagan didn't always govern like as a conservative
Right.
when you talked about it, and yet today he's known as the conservative, and every
Right.
Republican, whether they're moderate or Tea Party, libertarian, whatever, tries to be a Reagan
Right.
conservative. Why did that happen when, if you look at his record, most conservatives today would oppose a lot of the things he did?
Yeah, and just to talk about some of the things he did, he passed lots of tax hikes, both as president and as governor. He left California a bigger deficit than the one he inherited. He signed in 1967 the nation's first basically liberalized abortion law that allowed abortion in almost every instance, but 6 years before Roe versus Wade. I was watching one of those awesome campaign commercials right now that we have a campaign season, and it was like it was against a Democratic senator. I think it was against I forget which Democratic senator it was against, but one who had been in the Senate for a long time, and it said, Senator blah, blah, blah signed the biggest amnesty ever and made millions of Mexicans into American citizens. Da, da, da. Well, of course, this was a law that was both proposed and signed by Ronald Reagan. But an important thing about why he's still able to be kind of recuperated as kind of the ultimate conservative was whenever he did something that wasn't conservative, on the level of rhetoric, he would always kind of pass the buck on to the liberals. He would say, liberals control Congress, and I had to sign this tax increase. And doesn't that show how intractable and entrenched the liberal elites are? That even though we all know that we all want tax cuts, but we're forced to have tax hikes. Everything always kind of moved the ball a little bit to the right, even if he lost. So that kind of like, even when conservatism failed on the level of rhetoric, his supporters were able to kind of reaffirm their own sense that A, conservatism was right, and B, Ronald Reagan, really in his heart, was trying to be a good conservative. It's a really fascinating process, and I'll be writing more about it in my next book, which is this book goes through 1976, and that book's going to go through 1980. So you've been a great audience, and I hope...
Insights, we do have time for one more.
And we have time for one more question. Yeah, in the front. I have a 20-minute answer to that question, too, but I decided to cut it off.
Thank you for coming. I was just interested, like, after you've been talking and stuff, you say Ronald Reagan sort of presented this whole, the city on the hill ideal, and he was trying to edge away from this idea of a more critical thinking towards how the United States plays its role in the world and how the government operates at home. If he had not been elected president, could you say, the train that he sort of pushed back would have kept going? And if so, would we be in a different spot than we were today?
Those are the hardest questions for a historian to answer. It's the classic question of do forces make history or do great men make history? It's the question at the center of Tolstoy's War and Peace. And in this case, if you look at the Republicans who ran for president in 1980, they were all running as conservatives, with one exception, this guy named John Anderson, who was so fed up with the Republican Party that he actually left and ran as an independent, because things were really moving to the right in the Republican Party. So I think a conservative would have been nominated in 1980 no matter what, and probably Jimmy Carter would have lost, so probably we would have had a conservative Republican president. But Reagan's unique contribution to conservatism was, yes, this whole rhetoric of optimism. And as I point out in the book, it's almost universal now. It's like there's no one. You have like very mainstream magazines. I quote the New Republic. But certainly also like magazines like Time, which was millions of people read Time magazine, and it wouldn't quite say America was guilty of crimes, but it would say South Vietnam, which was the country we backed in the Vietnam War, was guilty of crimes. So there was this much more critical temper. Of course, conservatives were critical too, but they kind of hold up this kind of idea that there's an essential Americanness that's being betrayed by the liberals. So the domestic policies are not really American at all, right? But I think that was also the way the nation was going. That's why the bicentennial celebration is so important in the book, because everyone's like, wow, it's not that hard to revert to the old-fashioned patriotism anyway. Nostalgia was a huge part of popular culture in the 1970s. You probably know the TV show Happy Days, which took place in the 50s and kind of like before the chaos of the 60s ever happened. But Happy Days was kind of inspired by a movie that came out in 1973 called American Graffiti, which was much the same way. A singer named Bette Midler had a big top 10 hit with a song from the 40s called the Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy. You could go to these restaurants and they would kind of some of the folks of a certain age might remember restaurants like Shakey's and the Ground Round, Farrell's, that kind of marketed a certain kind of nostalgia, like 19th century style restaurants, right? So this idea that was very deep in the popular culture that was independent of Reagan helped kind of push Reagan to the fore politically. So that's all in the book. So read it and weep or smile. Thank you. I'll be right here. Oh, you got a mug for me?
Yes.
Awesome.
Thank you all for coming. On my right, there's going to be a book signing. Please form a line if you're interested. And for you, on behalf of the New Hampshire Institute of Politics, we'd like to present you with this gift.
Oh, they talk about the tea baggers. I'm a tote bagger.